The idea of popular sources and scholarly sources being different probably is not a new topic for you. You might have heard about the different types of sources in a few classes, though the focus might have been something like Wikipedia is not a good source. We could question that statement, but for now, we're going to work on identifying the differences between popular and scholarly sources to make sure we're all on the same page. Then, in a separate recording, I'll explain more about the characteristic of scholarly sources. I'm assuming that at least one of your past classes has helped you learn about the different popular sources, so we're not going to touch on that. This slide includes copies of the opening segments of two articles about the same topic, one from a popular source, The Atlantic, which publishes as a magazine, and one from a scholarly source, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The web pages tend to be representative of the print version, when there is one, so we can use these as an example of a popular source and a scholarly source. Before I go on, please pause the recording or take a second before you move to the next slide and examine the two images in this slide. See how many differences you notice when you compare the two sources. Okay, how many differences did you notice? There are at least 4. One thing you might have noticed at a glance is that the page for the popular source has a color picture, and the page for the scholarly source doesn't really have a picture that goes with the article. That's an example of one of the differences between scholarly sources and popular sources that might be the most noticeable: style and formatting. Scholarly sources are usually much more simple. They're usually just black and white. Notice that even the web page for the scholarly source is only black, white, red, and blue. Scholarly sources also only use pictures if they're part of the study. Similarly, if a scholarly source uses a graphic, it's part of the study, or a diagram to explain a particular part of the article. The figures in this slide are from the PDF of the scholarly article and are good examples of how scholarly sources use visual elements. The popular source also includes advertising. Popular sources usually include advertising of some sort and likely depend on it to continue publication. In the age of algorithms, you can tell I'd been shopping for new running shoes around the time I took the screenshot. Scholarly sources, on the other hand, might not include any advertising. If they do, it's limited to journals, conferences, and professional organizations. Another thing you might have noticed is the titles. Referring to the neuroscientist blasting his core is definitely a different tone than areas of the cerebral cortex. It goes along with a few differences between the two types of publications. The difference in the titles goes along with the fact that these two types of publications target different audiences. The general public might be a little put off by the technical terminology in the title of the scholarly article. The titles also fit with the different purposes of the two types of sources. Popular sources are intended to entertain, inform, or persuade the reader, whereas scholarly sources present a theory or the results of a study. The writing styles also tend to differ in much the same way as the titles of these two articles are different. Popular sources use language and sentence structure in a way that makes them easier to read, while scholarly sources tend to use technical terms that are unique to the discipline and more formal sentence structure. Another difference between scholarly and popular sources is often the credentials of the authors. In this case, the popular press publication actually gives the authors credentials. That's not always the case, and sometimes they might not even identify an individual author. This author is actually a medical doctor, but in many sources, the author might not have any more credentials than you do. In contrast, scholarly sources are written by academics or professionals working in the field who have graduate degrees. Their academic and professional affiliations are typically included with their names on the article, like the example in this slide. The final difference I'll mention is the ease and cost of accessing the sources. Many popular sources are freely available on the internet. If there's a subscription charge, it tends to be less expensive compared to the scholarly sources. For example, access to The Atlantic, the publication for the Blasting His Core article, is $30 a year for print, delivery, and digital access. In comparison, a personal subscription to the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which published the Adrenal Medulla article, is $235 a year. Many readers access scholarly sources through their employers or school, though. Some scholarly information is freely available even if you don't work at a school or an organization that subscribes. Scholarly articles typically include an abstract that summarizes the article, and that information is freely available on the internet. Google Scholar is one way to find it. The full text version of some articles is available for free too. The Google Scholar entry for this article, for example, includes a link that opens the PDF of the article and a notation that it's free. Copies of articles are also sometimes available on the internet through various sources. They're not always available legally, though, which can make it unreliable to find them again. Okay, we've talked about how popular sources are different from scholarly sources. Does that mean one is better than the other? Not necessarily. It depends a little on how we define better. There are many scholarly sources that pass the test of a savvy skeptic, are easier to access, and are easier to read. There are also some scholarly articles that are questionable. We differentiate between the two types of sources because we look at different things when we question their accuracy. So we could think of this as step one in practicing savvy skepticism. Decide if the source is popular or scholarly. The information in this recording provides several criteria for figuring that out, from looking at the formatting and the type of advertising, if there is any. Then you could look at the writing style to get an idea of the intended audience and purpose. By that point, you might have a pretty good idea of whether it's scholarly or popular, but the information about the author and what you need to do to access the full text of the source are sometimes just as noticeable.